quindi poche barzellette ma che fanno molto ridere. Allora, buongiorno a tutti, io sono particolarmente onorato di portare i saluti istituzionali in questo splendido convegno, quindi vi porto i saluti della nostra rettrice, la professoressa Briganti, del nostro direttore di dipartimento, il professor Tommaso De Valentini, e del nostro preside, il professor Andrea Gentile. In generale, diciamo così, ho raccolto un grande apprezzamento per questa iniziativa che è stata organizzata oggi, nel senso che voi tutti sapete che l'Università Marconi è un'università ancora relativamente piccola, ma ci stiamo, diciamo così, armando per affrontare le sfide della ricerca, sempre di più anche quelle della ricerca, e in quest'ambito, come dire, l'iniziativa di oggi è particolarmente gradita. Siamo, questo lo dico senza retorica, molto molto onorati di avere come ospite una personalità così, come dire, ispirante all'interno delle scienze umane. No, è inutile che io ricordi i grandi meriti scientifici, accademici e anche di organizzazione della ricerca del professor Wieviorka, ma diciamo così li sapete tutti quanti meglio di me e verranno ripetuti, suppongo, varie volte. La cosa che mi faceva molto piacere sottolineare è che proprio in un'atmosfera come quella di oggi avere il coraggio anche di affrontare certi temi delicati dal punto di vista della coscienza civile e affrontarli a livello universitario è una cosa che non è affatto banale e che può essere, diciamo così, un motore di propulsione per diciamo, l'accrescimento e la conquista del sapere scientifico per niente secondario. Quindi sono a maggior ragione, diciamo così, molto molto contento di questa iniziativa che vedo, insomma, sarà come dire, intensa e partecipata molto più di quanto non si veda, nel senso che mi fa piacere ricordare che noi abbiamo una diretta streaming sul canale YouTube della Marconi. Quindi i tecnici mi hanno chiesto di ricordarvi di parlare rigorosamente nei microfoni, perché altrimenti qui ci si sente, però tutta quanta la diretta streaming si perde. E siccome le dirette streaming di queste cose, per quanto può sembrare, diciamo così, forse a me che sono un po' boomer strano, hanno un grosso seguito. Quindi, diciamo così, tenetene conto quando parlate, perché ci potrebbero essere molte persone interessate che magari non sono presenti fisicamente, ma che no, noi siamo un'università telematica, quindi abbiamo, diciamo così, una rete di contatti di questo tipo che davvero funziona. Ci ho detto, appunto, lavori che vedo saranno intensi oggi e domani. Vi faccio i miei migliori auguri per il proseguo del convegno e ringrazio tutti quanti per essere qui.
Sì, sì. Sì, allora grazie per l'invito in questo bellissimo convegno. Io porto i saluti della nostra sezione di teorie sociologiche e trasformazioni sociali, dell'Associazione Italiana di Sociologia, ma anche quelli più in generale dell'associazione, essendo io presidente della consulta della ricerca dell'AIS. AIS che ha voluto fortemente appoggiare, promuovere questa importantissima iniziativa, tanto è vero che domani avremo anche il presidente nazionale della nostra associazione, il professor Stefano Domelleri, e l'abbiamo convintamente appoggiata perché riteniamo che sia molto importante riflettere e sviluppare una prospettiva comunque di lettura delle cose, dei fenomeni sociali, dove la riflessione teorica sta al centro, diciamo, di un ragionamento per cui, lo dicevamo poco fa, prima dell'inizio del convegno con il professor Wieviorka, che in qualche maniera sia in grado di rimettere insieme, no, i diversi fili delle varie specializzazioni accademiche, delle varie specializzazioni anche all'interno della disciplina sociologica, e soprattutto che faccia un po' da argine ad una tendenza che in Italia è abbastanza diffusa, a privilegiare una lettura empirista, diciamo, molto legata alle ricerche empiriche fatte anche molto bene dal punto di vista tecnico-metodologico, ma che poi non sono in grado di far avanzare invece una riflessione teorica che è assolutamente necessaria. E quindi l'iniziativa di oggi è molto importante perché il professor Wieviorka e la scuola alla quale appartiene, no? Una grande scuola della sociologia internazionale, che è stata animata, fondata da Alain Touraine e da Michel Wieviorka, oltre che da tanti altri, e che a me è particolarmente cara perché ho dedicato a quella scuola tanti studi sin dall'inizio della mia carriera accademica, tant'è che la mia tesi di dottorato è stata dedicata proprio a Alain Touraine, alle sue prospettive, alle sue ricerche sui movimenti sociali. E questa scuola è una scuola che non studia soltanto i singoli fenomeni, no? Empirici, non studia soltanto i movimenti, ma cerca di leggerli all'interno di una chiave di lettura della società più ampia, e quindi mostra come sia necessario mettere insieme la ricerca empirica e lo sviluppo di una prospettiva complessiva di lettura della società. Io credo che questo sia il contributo più importante che Michel Wieviorka ha dato allo sviluppo della sociologia contemporanea. Lo ha fatto in tantissime opere, ricerche importantissime come quelle legate al terrorismo, alla violenza, che io conosco di più per le cose di cui diciamo mi occupo, ma lo ha fatto anche istituzionalmente quando è stato, ricordiamolo, presidente dell'ISA, dell'International Sociological Association, che costituisce un punto di riferimento fondamentale per lo sviluppo del dibattito sociologico a livello internazionale. Quindi per me è un grande piacere e onore stare all'interno di questa iniziativa. L'Associazione Italiana di Sociologia sarà sempre al fianco di chi fa questo tipo di ragionamenti, e non ne abbiamo parlato con Emanuele, ma mi farebbe molto piacere se potessimo ragionare anche sulla realizzazione di un volume magari che raccoglie i contributi che verranno discussi in questo convegno, primo tra tutti la Lectio Magistralis del professor Wieviorka, che possiamo appunto realizzare e promuovere anche grazie all'aiuto della nostra associazione di sociologia. Io non rubo altro tempo, grazie ancora e buon convegno. Poi interverrò in una sessione, insomma, oggi pomeriggio per discutere alcune cose dell'opera del professore.
Ok, grazie a tutti per essere qui. Io introdurrò velocemente in inglese il professor Wieviorka e vi dico velocemente quale sarà il programma di oggi. Ci sarà una Lectio Magistralis del professor Wieviorka, a cui seguirà poi nel pomeriggio seguiranno 2 panel intorno ai temi che nel corso della sua lunga carriera accademica Michel Wieviorka ha sviluppato. E domani, come ricordava Francesco, ci sarà un dialogo tra il presidente dell'Associazione Italiana di Sociologia, il professor Tomelleri, e il professor Wieviorka, che chiuderà diciamo questa 2 giorni molto intensa. Allora, I will do this presentation in English so Michel can understand me in a proper way. As already underlined by my colleagues, it's a great pleasure for me, for us, and for this university to have with us a worldwide known and recognized academic and sociologist such as Prof. Michel Wieviorka, that with his scientific and theoretical works, his researches, has given a huge and terrific contribution to the development of sociology and social sciences in the last 40 years at least. Starting his career working with another worldwide known sociologist, Alain Touraine, Michel Wieviorka headed the research center CADIS, Centre d'analyse et d'intervention sociologique at the HESS, École des études en sciences sociales, in Paris, for a long time, from 1993 to 2009. The center was founded by Alain Touraine in the early 80s. The international recognition of Michel Wieviorka has been witnessed by the important key role he played being president of the International Sociological Association from 2006 to 2010, and member of the Executive Committee of International Council of Social Sciences in the UNESCO. And he also have been president of the Fondation Maison des Sciences de l'Homme from 2009 to 2020. Fondation Maison des Sciences de l'Homme that is one of the most prestigious institutions in Europe for social sciences. Concepts such as social movement, violence, racism, migration, democracy, subjectivity, subjectivation and desubjectivation processes, radicalization cannot be treated from a sociological point of view without dealing with Michel Wieviorka theorization and explanations. His contribution has been and still is fundamental to explain the changes of the world around us and the challenges that sociology and social sciences must face to deal with and to understand these transformations. Michel Wieviorka's sociology is an open sociology, eager to understand actors and their subjectivity, explained as a process to understand and give meaning to what they do and what surrounds them, to understand their individual and collective action, but also their difficulties of being actors. At the same time, Michel Wieviorka's sociology is a global sociology that overcomes all dogmatism, do away with the tired paradigm of the 20th century. A sociology that is able to think globally, overcoming methodological nationalism, according to the famous expression of Ulrich Beck, and explain the future instead of getting lost in the memory of the past. To understand nowadays world, Michel Wieviorka invites us to reflect on a large perspective that starts from the individual subjectivity to the globalization processes that more and more affect our lives. A social theoretical perspective able to keep together with the more scientific and current possible rigor the global and individual subjective dimensions, a critique du sujet from one end and the advice to penser global, thinking globally, quoting two titles of the 9 Leçons de Sociologie. This is a fundamental book that from Michel Wieviorka to understand his social theory. I will close this short presentation with a couple of personal memories linked to the year I spent in Paris during my PhD, where Michel Wieviorka supervised my thesis. When I first met Michel, he was already a worldwide well-known sociologist whose work on social movement, racism, violence, and cultural differences were known and studied all over the world. And it was the director at the Cadiz at that time. Between brackets, I remember I was terrified just speaking with him, asking questions during his seminars, and I felt so tiny in front of him. Anyway, my strongest personal memories about that period are mainly two. The first one is about the seminars held by Michel Wieviorka. I remember his way of explaining and speaking about sociology, sociological concepts and theories as the most natural thing in the world. Also, I remember the people he used to invite to give lessons during his seminars, and one in particular I remember completely blown my mind, Michel Sandel and his lesson on justice. It was for me very fundamental. My other memories are linked to the sociological community around the Cadiz, the research center headed by Michel. In particular, the people who have been his students from all over the world. With most of them, we are still in contact after so many years, in some cases working together, attending conferences organized by one another, building up collaborations and projects, sharing a sociological perspective that comes from Cadiz and Michel Wieviorka teaching. I think that the most important legacy that a master can leave to the future generations is a community of scholars who, starting from his teaching, try to understand the world we live and to provide answers to the changes and transformations. I've been very lucky to have the possibility to learn from you, Michel. And that's the reason why I thank you for all this and for being with us today. Merci. Ok, so, quando vuoi, quando tu veux, tu peux commencer.
Parlo troppo poco italiano, lei parla troppo poco francese e Emanuele mi ha detto English. So for me it's a shame, but I will do it. It's a shame because I've been always fighting for the possibility of each of us to speak his or her own language. And when I was president of ISA, I promoted French and Spanish, which were the two other languages facing a very strong English domination, and I lost, I must say. But who knows? Maybe things will change one day. So thank you, Emmanuel, for this invitation. Thank you all of you which have been organizing, helping. This takes always much more time than when you organize real things, it takes time. So I thank you very warmly. It's a pleasure. And when Emmanuel invited me to come here, I first thought, well, I must not talk about the past. I am not so young, so usually old sociologists or thinkers and so on want to say, I have done this and I did that and so on. No, this is not my idea, so I will try to be oriented towards future much more than past. But sometimes I have to deal with past also. And so I suggested to give as a provisional title for this meeting, for this talk, the title of Elements for a New Manifesto for the Social Sciences. So I will try to not to be totally new, but to try. In 2013, I published with Craig Calhoun. Some of you may know him. He was at that time he was the head of the LSE in London. I published, and he's a very good friend of mine, an American colleague. We published together a manifesto for the social sciences. And it was published as an article, a big article, then as a book with comments by Alain Touraine, who said, you could do more, you should do more. This was Touraine. He was always like that, pushing you. And also comments by Edgar Morin, the two older French sociologists. Morin is more than 100 years old, and Touraine a little bit less, but they are intellectually the younger sociologists I know in my country. But this is something different. So, what was in this manifesto? We first of all, we called for the truth about the social life. The idea of truth was very important. We were aware of the need for the social sciences to modify their modes of approach, to enter new intellectual spaces, to raise also the question, which is not so frequent, of what is proof, what is evaluation of a research, to discuss this point. We also were aware of the complex links between social science and democracy. The last book, very recent book by Craig Calhoun with Charles Taylor and another colleague from India, is about degeneration of democracy. So 10 years ago, it was a key issue for it. And also we were, of course, interested in social movements, to the knowledge of organizations, institutions. We had also deep interest, strong interest for the media, and we insisted at that time of the usefulness of the co-production of knowledge, which means sociology with other disciplines, and not only other disciplines, with all kinds of actors. This was 10 years ago. Today, the developments have been much more pronounced. Whether it is a question of considering the world in which we live, considering the approaches specific to its study, or taking, to say it differently, having an interest rather in sociology or rather in society. You have two kinds of sociologists. Some of them prefer sociology, others prefer society. I think we should do both, of course, work on two legs. And the changes are considerable. And I am much more convinced on what I am saying now if I consider another of my publication at more or less the same time, 2013 or 14. I published a very small book at the CNRS, which is the main French institution for research, a very small book, the title of which in French was L'impératif numérique, digital imperative. And the idea was, social scientists almost don't use digital tools. They don't know a lot about what we can do with this. We social scientists, we should enter this new world of digital technology, data, and so on. And it was a kind of appeal to my colleagues, please, take this seriously. Internet, social networks, and so on. It was in 2012 or 13. Today, I'm living exactly the contrary. All my colleagues are totally in internet, social networks, data, and so on. Maybe too much. Maybe without enough real field work. This would be my point. But it's clear social sciences are in a digital era, and we must consider this as a key, it's a key issue. We have done the digital turn now. It's clear. But this does not mean that social science are leaders in the field of using and working on digital issues. Because if we compare our resources with the resources of private big companies, the French, I don't know if you use this expression, GAFA, is to say Google, Apple, Facebook, and so on, they are so rich, so powerful, they can put a lot of money on social science devoted to what they do, or what they want to do. And we don't have the leadership as social scientists working in universities, research centers, and so on. The state, I'm glad to see my friend Roberto. The state, on the one hand, and these big companies are very, very powerful, and we social scientists must be aware of that. We are not leaders, or not easily, or not necessarily. We can be, but with a lot of imagination and time. We should also take into consideration a kind of malaise in the social sciences, and I would say a few words. It is not new to consider a key point, which is that researchers are more and more confined to silos. That is to say, narrow issues. Everyone working on a very, very special point without being really able to participate in general scientific or intellectual or political life. It's clear. We have the feeling that this is new. I found in a paper by Max Horkheimer between the two world wars, I found some wonderful sentences about the danger for the social science to be more and more restricted to very specific issues. So this is a general historical tendency, but very strong today. And I think we should try and see why are we not only confined to silos, but also why are we not so strong in the public life, in the media, in the public debates, in the political debates. I remember 50 years ago, social science were the key actors in intellectual life in many countries. And France was the center of the world, and Paris was the center of the world. People were coming from all over the world to listen to Bourdieu, to Rennes, great historians, great philosophers, and so on. Today this is finished. We don't intervene so much in the public life. So why? What did we lose? First of all, as I say, we are too much specialized. I am very surprised, I don't know if it is the case in your country, to see that in France, when we say sociological knowledge, we first of all listen to pollsters, people that make polls. We have two very good ones, at least, that published very good books. One is called Jérôme Fourquet. If you ask me, is there a good book about France today? Maybe I would say read L'Archipel Français, the French archipelago, by Jérôme Fourquet, who is a pollster, I don't remember very well. And there is another one, Brice Teinturier, who was also very, very good. So these are the people that say, what is social life today in my country? And so it's a real problem, I see. We must also consider the fact that today, good journalists, because they are not all bad, good journalists have a very solid background, sociological, philosophical, political. They have been to Sciences Po in Paris, like people that become then social scientists. And so there is a kind of competition, and if you'd have very good journalists that can analyze with sociological tools the life of the country or the world, why should we listen to sociologists or to social scientists more generally thinking? So, but the main explanation for me is that even if social scientists can be politically very diverse, right or left, there is a very famous book by Nisbet, I think, explaining that social scientists have been right much more than left-oriented in the past. But out of that, if you don't have a strong push, a political push on the left, if you don't have a real left in your country, if you don't like social movements, if you don't have all these elements that are on the left much more than on the right side of the political life, of the social life, then social scientists meet very huge difficulties to participate in the public debate. I consider I don't know the Italian case, I think it's worse than the French one, but even in France, we don't listen in my country to intellectuals like me. I am one of the very few that have sometimes the possibility to appear in the media. We listen to rightist intellectuals, and rightist intellectuals don't like social science. For instance, one of the more brilliant and solid, whose name is Alain Finkielkraut, you may know his name, he hates social science. He hates us, not as persons, sometimes also as persons, but he hates what we are doing. So there are many problems. I don't have solutions, but I think that we should try to analyze more why aren't we, social scientists or sociologists, why aren't we anymore at the very center of their intellectual general life? I think it's a key point. My second point, which I would like to deal with, is the importance of ethical issues or ethical dimensions in our life as social scientists. My first remark will be, and I was glad that when you quote Michael Sandel, my first point is that on some important issues connected with ethics, philosophers come before us. It was clear when I was working on multiculturalism. I have a strong interest for multiculturalism. I've been part of the French and sometimes international debate on this issue. But I must say, the key people are philosophers. If I say Michael Sandel, if I say Michael Walzer, Charles Taylor, Will Kimlicka, and so many others, they are philosophers. Social scientists exist a little bit, but not so much. And it is the same with ethical issues. Many philosophers today discuss ethics, and not so much or not so many sociologists. Maybe I should, before dealing really with ethics, say a word about something which is connected with ethics, which is the possibility for the social scientists, the sociologists, to appear as being totally neutral. If you want to make ethics, it's not moral. Ethics means you have no commitment, no personal commitment, no cultural values in what you are dealing with. So if you want to work on ethics, there is a key issue. Is it possible to belong to this category of thinkers that deal with axiological neutrality? An expression that comes from Max Weber, and which was also used by Norbert Elias and many others. My point here, but this can be discussed, is that for us, axiological neutrality does not exist. We have always something to do with what we are working on. Always. It's not necessarily clear, it's not necessarily obvious, but it is always the case. And the idea that we are totally neutral when we deal with social movements, organizations, institutions, whatever, this idea for me is absolutely not acceptable. What we should do, this would be my point, is to try to analyze what is our relationship to are objects. Not to say I'm neutral, to say I have a relationship, what it is. And if you can do that, it can be very useful. I don't know if I said that to Emanuele when he was in Paris, but often for my PhD students, I used to tell them, have a chapter at the very end of your thesis, an annex or whatever, where you discuss this point. Why do I study this? And what is my relationship with my object? It's always useful. So, to say differently, we should not consider that we are out of what we are working on. And another point, if you want to discuss ethics, we must not accept the confusion of analysis and action, which is the very contrary of axiological neutrality, but which is also a big problem. I say that because I see in my country and in other places also a strong tendency to work on some issues where activism is very close to research. And this is true in my country for those people that work on gender, those people that work on race, and those people that work on sometimes on inequalities, and this can lead to devastating results. Because when you are an activist, you are not a researcher. Of course, you can be both. We are all both. But we have to articulate, not to confound the two dimensions. And what happens is that when people are activists, sometimes they accept or they are part of abuses, of excesses. I am anti-wokist. I don't know if the Italian debate on wokism is strong. In France, it started 2 or 3 years ago, and it is very strong. So people are criticizing wokist people like myself. I am considered as a very dangerous Islamo-leftist. I am considered as a wokist, and sometimes it's very strong. Why? Because I say just something which is absolutely important. We should not accept excesses, abuses. There are a lot of them with those people that work on gender, race, and so on. But we must not forget that the more important are not these excesses, these abuses. The more important is the social movement that are connected with the issues that people want to see only through the lens of wokeism. If I tell you Black Lives Matter, if I tell you Me Too, of course I will find with Black Lives Matter people or with Me Too people some excesses sometimes. A lot of intolerance, for instance. And I will criticize this. But I think we should be aware that those that criticize wokeism, as they say, those people also, there is a French expression, I am not able to translate it very well into English, which says, these people jettent le bébé avec l'eau du bain. They throw the baby in the water where the baby is having a bath. So, I don't know, in Italian there should be something like that also. So this is but what I mean here is that if there are these wokist or anti-wokist campaigns, it's also because some people are confounding action and analysis and transform theory, concepts, research. They make a kind of, they're in a confusion between this and transforming the world directly. And this is really a key issue. So I wanted to say that, and I can give you a very precise example, which is very important for me. I am in favor of intersectionality as a concept. I think it's very interesting to say that if you suffer from different inequalities, forms of domination, and so on, what you are suffering is more than just the simple addition of being a woman, being a Muslim, being poor, having a disability, and so on. I think it's interesting as a concept. And when I was younger, I loved Angela Davis, who was saying something like that. And like most of you, I suppose, I've read Kimberly Crenshaw and all this. It's very interesting. It's very interesting as a concept. But some people say, starting from this concept, I consider that the salt of the earth, the key actor in the world, are those people that are at the same time women with disabilities, poor, belonging to a minority, and so on and so on. That is to say, in the past, at a time when class was a key category, the key actor was the worker. The key actor with intersectionality policies should be the person who is the more intersectional. This is not true. Politically, this does not work. On the contrary. So, this is to say, analysis is something, action, politics, for instance, is something else. And we should be able to pass from one to the other in our way of thinking, but not to say it is the same. So, to be clear with this example, yes, for intersectionality, when we are discussing as social scientists, not, but no, for intersectionality, if I want to know who is the key dominated actor, the center of social movement in the future, if this actor is defined by intersectionality, I would not accept it. So, ethics now, to be after this, some elements. Ethics, first of all, is a question for us. We must live as social scientists in an ethical world. We must live in universities with freedom for research, with freedom to propose our truth. There are today, and I must say that, very important struggles because there are difficulties with academic freedom. I'm part of a network with some people, for instance, from Warwick. You remember Daniel Joly, Emmanuel, but also maybe some of you know him, Livio Mattei, who was the rector in the Central University of Europe in Budapest, and with a certain number of people, we try to deal with this issue. There is no social science if there is no academic freedom. So social science need academic freedom, and this is part of the problem. But sometimes social scientists participate in what are for me too much ethical visions of what should be done. And here we enter in interesting case. I don't know how you consider what I'm going to say, but it's very important. Today, a certain number of institutions say to researchers, you cannot research if you don't, for instance, ask to any people you are interviewing to ask these people to sign an agreement. And I was thinking, would Lévi-Strauss, traveling in the jungle in Amazonia, ask to Indians who he was meeting, please sign so that I can say something about you? Would William Foote White, writing Street Corner Society, meeting young people, playing with them, I don't remember what, but would he tell them, I am a sociologist and I need your signature so that I can? Of course not. So my point is that, yes, we need ethical rules, but we should define them by ourselves. We don't have to obey to norms that are more and more frequent in research. The first time I discovered this was when I was making some research in England on violence, young people violence. And I had an agreement with the University of Warwick. I was bringing the money. I was working with a good colleague of mine, Daniel Joly, and we were going to make some sociological intervention. And we were beginning to organize this, and the university said, you are going to work on people from Caribs. You must have in your administrative team, I don't speak on the field, you must have people from Caribs. And for me, it was shocking. I understand the idea, but for me, it was very shocking. So I cannot choose somebody because he or she will be good for the job. I must choose somebody because he or she is from such or such minority. So what I want to say is that we must be very careful with, if we want to fight for academic freedom, we must also be very responsible and not to let some bureaucrats coming from our milieu, most of them, bad social scientists, decide that we should ask for signatures and all this. To say it differently, I think that we should fight against normativity. If we want ethics, we don't want norms or moral norms and this kind of normativity, which doesn't mean that there are no deontological rules. Of course, we need them, but not like that. So now I would like to speak of ethics as part of the problems that we are working. I'm sure that in Italy you had the same debate that we had in France, and maybe you had it before. When the virus, the COVID-19 appeared, in Italy it was terrible in the northern part of the country. And we had also the same kind of difficulties in France, and in France, I suppose you had exactly the same debate, we suddenly happened to have an ethical debate, which was, you are a medical doctor in a hospital. There is only one bed for somebody who is arriving with COVID. Two people arrive at the same moment. Who is going to benefit from the bed and who is going to die? So it appeared as a big ethical debate. So in my country, the result was, if everything is more or less the same, let us choose to save the younger person. Because if you are old, you had your life, and if you are young, you should have your life. But then I tried to think about it, and I published an article to say, this is an ethical problem because it has not been treated as a political problem. If the government before decides to put money in hospitals or to put money in beds rather than other political domains, then this problem does not happen. So my first point was, this is not an ethical problem, this is a political problem. But then I tried to say, no, it is also an ethical problem. Because why should the government decide to choose to finance beds or to finance other politics? So my point finally, I'm so happy to see Antimo Faro. Bonjour Antimo. And so finally, politics should take into consideration ethics issues, but not let ethical issues appear at the very last moment when some people will be obliged to decide ethically, which is not their job. A medical doctor should not decide. He should know what to do. So this is this kind of issues that become more and more important. Ethical issues appear more and more. I remember many years ago, maybe 15 years ago, Michael Walzer writing a book on what is a fair war, une guerre juste, I don't know in English, une guerre juste. What is it? I was part, at that time, I have been part of the French scientific board for military issues. It was a kind of council, which was not useful at all, but we love to discuss this with military people. And I was asked to prepare a report with some other people on, does ethical weapons exist? It's very interesting. The answer, after discussing with many people, interviewing, the result was, no. It's not an issue. War is not ethical. The only point I remember which could be ethical was to say we should try to make sure that people don't use toys for children with some explosives within, so that you put one of these toys in a city in Ukraine, the children comes and plays with the toy. So this is not ethical. But out of that, the result was, if you are in a situation of war, ethics does not exist, or arms that don't exist. So, but it's not only here. In many other fields today, ethical dimensions are part of the issue. It is true with business. It is true with consumption. It is true with tourism. It is true with economic life. Listen to what managers in companies say today. We must be ethical. I made a research, very interesting, on L'Oréal, a very big global company. They want to be ethical. That is to say, not to destroy any life when they prepare some new cosmetic, to be fair with all minorities and so on. And so diversity is important, environment is important for them, this kind of... So this is, they say, we have to be an ethical company. So ethics appear in business, in consumption. We must be ethical consumption, ethical when we are consumers, and so on. So I don't want to be too heavy, but maybe the main point is ethics are absolutely key when you discuss death or life. That is to say, I organized 20 years ago a conference. The title was Disposing of Life, Disposing of Death. How do you deal with this issue? And here, ethics are very important. The danger here is that to consider that the first ethical important thinkers should absolutely be religious leaders. In my country, ethical committees, first of all, you have a priest, a rabbi, a Protestant leader, now a Muslim, because we have Muslims in the country, and so on. Those people are considered as ethical figures. But I think we could also have philosophers and maybe social scientists. So, today, ethics, this was my second point, are part of the new paradigm of the social science. We cannot treat it as secondary. The third point, and it is not so far from this, is how we consider democracy today. Today, we have the feeling that democracy in many countries is weakening. We speak of illiberal democracy. And at the same time, we should absolutely consider the fact that there is a very strong intellectual, conceptual renewal when we discuss democracy. This started in the 70s, and it started, from my point of view, with the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union. Why? Because when you had a strong communist regime, Soviet regimes were very solid at that time, then democracy was not to be discussed. It was the contrary of what was happening in Moscow or in the Soviet Empire. So we did not have to discuss so much what is democracy. What are the limits? What are the difficulties of democracy? Democracy is good because it's the contrary of communism, more or less. This was the general idea. And it was also, for some people, but not as many, it was also good because it was the contrary of dictatorship. We should not forget that in the early 70s, in Europe, in this part of the world, Spain, Portugal, and Greece were under dictatorship. So democracy was the contrary of communism and of dictatorship. Then democracy, when dictatorships faded away in Europe and also in Latin America, very important, communism was decomposed, and Fukuyama came in 1989 and said, it's the end of history and the general triumph of market and democracy. And that's it. And then we understood that maybe it could be very important to discuss more on democracy. So what is, from my point of view, the movement of ideas came also from philosophers. For me, the very, very starting point is with John Rawls' Theory of Justice, which was published in 70 or 71 in America, in my country only 20 years after. That's I don't know in Italy if it was translated. So, and why? Because after Rawls published his book on justice, some people say, yes, but this is a very, how can I say? It is a view which is not open to minorities, which is a view which is not open to identities, collective identities. And this, Michael Sandel, among others, intervened to say, we should discuss differently, protest, not accept John Rawls' vision, because we must take into consideration minorities, identities, and so on. And it was the beginning of new discussion on democracy. It was a moment when multiculturalism began a very important issue with two dimensions. On the one hand, a social dimension, and on the other one, a cultural dimension. The social dimension was, what do we do for these people that are members of a minority which, for structural reasons, suffer from inequalities? And the idea was affirmative action. But some people say, no, it's not a good idea. I don't want to enter in this debate. And on the other hand, the debate was, what do we do with those people that belong to minorities and that want to be recognized, not socially, but culturally, for their history, their language, their culture, their traditions, and so on? Do we accept or not to recognize differences? Say it very briefly. So, these are two different issues, sometimes connected, but not necessarily. You can say we need affirmative action to help, for instance, black people to become students or to become professors in American university. This is social. You can say we must recognize black culture, African American culture. We must have departments in universities where people can work on black literature, music, arts, history, and so on. It's different. So culture and the cultural and the social aspects are different, but both are part of this big discussion on democracy. Then came, and this was much more 10 years after, debates, and these debates were also introduced by philosophers much more than by sociology. We have then the idea that there was a crisis of political representation, and that we need maybe to find something. And it was the beginning of all these debates on participation, deliberation, and so on. And for me, one of the main person in this area was Habermas, who is also a philosopher, first of all. So we began to discuss these issues. Can democracy be more than only or mainly representative? What do we do with political deliberation, with democratic participation? I don't want to be more precise. So the second point was the beginning, the crisis of political systems, left and right and so on, and the idea that we should discuss different. Then came another point, which is that populism became more and more important in many countries. I wrote a small book in 1993, so many years ago, the title of which was La démocratie à l'épreuve. So democracy is at stake, and under that, nationalism, populism, and ethnicity. And so I was among the first ones that wrote something like that. Today, you have many books that say exactly this kind of things, including, there are 3 books that took my title. On the one hand, I don't like that, but on the other one, La démocratie à l'épreuve, you have 3 other books in French. So, what happens is that we should work much more on populism. Today, most books and articles on populism say the same. It began in Russia and in America at the end of the 19th century, then Latin America, and then national populism, extreme right, and so on. It's always the same pattern which is followed by authors. I think we should be much more, we should work much more, and this is for us, social scientists, when we deal with populism, we should try to understand what is coming after populism. Because populism, from my point of view, is a mythical discourse. A mythical discourse, that is to say, a discourse that proposes to solve with imaginary discourses what in the reality cannot be solved. So when you are far from power, you can have a mythical discourse because you don't have to do anything really. But when you are close to power, it's okay. In Italy, it's a case in my countries with the former National Front, which is called now Rassemblement National. It's a case in many other countries. People are, when they get access to the power, people that could be called populist when they were far from power change. Sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way. In France, I will say something which is totally not correct politically. The National Front is very interesting, but they try to walk on two legs. And on the one hand, they want to be classical political actors, clean, not at all racist, not at all anti-Semitic, and so on the one hand. They want to be institutionalized. So the populism ends in clean politics, right, but clean, from my point of view. But on the other hand, we know that if they get access to power, it will be very authoritarian, and it will be with the support of people that like maybe some violence and some excesses and so on. So my point is that we should work much more on what happens to this mythical political discourse, populism, when the actors are getting access to political power, or not so far. It is transformed for the best or for the worst. And we could do the same kind of analysis for the past. What happens to the Russian populists? Some of them became terrorists, some of them became Marxist-Leninists, and so on. What happens in America with the People's Movement, the People's Party, which was also a populist movement? Some of them became totally racist, Ku Klux Klan, and so on. Others became Democrats. I mean, it's very interesting to work on the decomposition of mythical discourses, and this is for us. So this is my point. You tell me, yeah, I can, okay. So, we must also look at new combinations coming from populism. I will take two very interesting cases. The first one is Turkey. We are going to have the second turn of elections. There, at the beginning, it was a kind of populist discourse. I should be more precise, but today there is an alliance between religion and nation. It's something new, and extreme right in Turkey. And so Erdogan today is not Erdogan 20 years ago. If you look at Israel, it's also very interesting. The evolution to extreme right, the mixture of nationalism, religion, which could transform this democratic country into a theocratic country. So we must be aware of big transformation, not only of populism, but political formulas are not the same, even if the actors are the same. I would like to pass from democracy, and it will be my point number 4, from democracy to social movements. As you know, and say, and I'm not the only one here, I have been very close with Alain Touraine and with the sociology of social movement. And my first point is that, passing from democracy to social movement, democracy is the only political regime that accepts to propose at the same time a principle of unity. We are a whole, we are a country, a democratic country, but a whole, we are a nation. French would say we are a republic, on the one hand. So a principle of unity and a principle of plurality. Democracy makes possible to deal politically with differences, with conflict, with oppositions. The American motto is very clear: E pluribus unum. Pluribus unum. Democracy makes possible both diversity and unity. So democracy makes possible social movements, which mean Democracy makes possible social movement too. Now I would like to say a few words, and I was discussing with some of you just before we start. I would like to discuss with you the fact that we are at a very, very interesting moment for those social scientists that work on social movements, because we are passing from an industrial world with a certain kind of social movement to what we could call a post-industrial world, or post-industrial society, with other social movements, but this does not mean that the issues that were so important in the industrial era disappear. They still exist, and that if we want to understand what is at stake with social movement, we must take into consideration 3 dimensions. You have some social movements that are still typical from an industrial era. In my country, we have a very strong movement today where people say we want best organization, better conditions of work, in better another management. We want to discuss salaries. We want to discuss conditions of work, and so on and so on. These are very classical issues connected with what has been always important in the industrial society. Just kind of struggle. Then you have struggles that have nothing to do with this because they are part of a new post-industrial era. If I say climate change and protest, it is not industrial. And even it may appear as a contrary of industrial struggle. Working class movement in the past was not in favor of climate change mobilization. So these kind of points are very important. So the second category of social struggles that we have to deal with are part of a new era. And you also have struggles that are connected with the passing from an era to another era. People say something like, I don't want to pay for this. We had in France, I'm sure you heard about it, a very interesting movement which was called les Gilets jaunes, yellow jackets. Very interesting. These people are not working in industry, and they have no interest in management, organization of work. It's not their issue. They have nothing to do with trade unions. They ignore them or they hate them. It depends, but they have nothing to do. But these people have also no interest in climate change or in women's equality and so on. So these people say, my problem is that I don't have money enough to live, and I don't have public services. If I need a hospital, there is no hospital in the place where I live. The schools are closing and so on. I live in a desert and so on. So it's very important to understand that if we want to be scholars working on social movements today, we shall deal with concrete struggles where these 3 elements may exist and sometimes coexist. And the problem for us is how can we work on all these points together. This is for me fascinating, and the more interesting for me is when some actors say, let us try to articulate these different elements. And from this point of view, I am a strong supporter of a French trade union whose name is CFDT. The leader is a more famous leader of the trade unions today in France. His name is Laurent Berger. Maybe you have heard his name. And what they do, this trade union has created what they call an alliance, a pact, with 60 associations, NGOs, and so on, in order to take in the same action classical issues for trade unions, environmental issues, equality, women and men. I mean, all these issues connected with all these points. And this is a very interesting point. The idea is that you can try and articulate the different dimensions, but it is not always so so easy. So this is a real field for all. And I would like now to add something else. In the past, the more important social movement in the industrial society was the working class movement. It was at the very center of the collective life. And it was possible to work on it and at the very end to propose a concept of social movement that was very close to what this social movement was. Today things are changing a lot. And here there is a real challenge for us. And I have no answer. I can just say that there is a problem. We cannot use the paradigm which was invented for the social movements, taking only into consideration the working class movement. We, for instance, as a scholar, as a comment on dit un élève de Touraine, as following Alain Touraine, let us say it like that, as following Alain Touraine, I can say a social movement is the action of a dominated actor facing a dominating actor in order to control what Touraine calls historicity, the main values. What do we do with what we produce? And so. Okay, you cannot say now, let us try and find for the new social movements the adversary, the identity, and like we did with the working class movement. So my point is, if we enter in a new world with classical problems, but also new problems, we must invent new theorization of social movements. Of course, Touraine is very useful. Of course, also, I will say the other important way of dealing with social movements, which is Charles Tilly proposals and many others, the so-called mobilization of resources, is interesting also. But really, we need new paradigms, new dimensions, and new ways of thinking. So I will not develop too much this point because time is running, but it's important. And my main point also will be here. We must not consider that we finished with what was so important in the industrial society, which is work. There was a tendency when this new era began to be clear, there was a tendency to say, well, the old society is going out through this door, and the new society is entering with this other door. Finish the working class movement, the problems of industry, work, and so on. Let us discuss climate change, environment, and so on. It's not like that. But some people, important people, say, no, we are finishing with industrial society. We are finishing with work. Maybe you remember Jeremy Rifkin, for example, who published a book. The title was The End of Work. So, no, I think we should not discuss this, and that if you take this issue of work, we enter in very interesting discussion. In the industrial society, work was the key point if you wanted to understand why social actors want to rule the country. They want to get access to the state. They want the French communists had a wonderful vocabulary. They said, des lendemains qui chantent, mornings that are singing. I don't know if I can translate it like that. Des lendemains qui chantent, a new word and so on. So today we discuss a lot of work, but nobody says workers should be the leaders of the new society. So we should not consider that work is finished, but we must take seriously into consideration the importance of work and the capacity, in some cases at least, of trade unions to deal with these issues that belong to the new world. For instance, if trade unions say we don't accept where we work, we don't accept sexual harassment, we don't accept inequalities in salaries between men and women, they are taking into consideration these new gender aspects of collective life. If trade unions say we don't accept pollution, it's bad for our health, as workers, but it's bad also for the world if we produce too much pollution, bad gases, and bad carbons and carbonate. I say carbonate. Carbon. So there are some possibilities to articulate, and this is for us social scientists very very interesting. Now I would like to enter to another point which was a little bit raised by Emmanuel, which is the fact that when we work on social movement, we have a kind of heroic and romantic image. At the center of the life, they will change so many things. But we also know that social movements can be transformed into their contrary. That it is always possible that within a social movement, or with the same categories that are the categories of the social movement, actors appear and behave as what Turen and I have called anti-social movement. It's very interesting, the problem of translation. Should we say anti-social movements or social anti-movements? I have no answer, but maybe it could be different. In French, anti-mouvements sociaux, that's just so. And I think that I think that these are very important things. It's not only the populist decomposition, which I dealt with a little bit before. It's the fact that social movements may have their counterpart, sometimes in the social movement, sometimes out. If you look at Nazism, Stalinism, Mussolinism, there was at the beginning some dimensions of social movements. And Nazism means National Socialism. And there was, so how can a social movement, workers' movement, and so can be transformed into an anti-social movement? Let me be, I'm being very careful with this, but let me say, in France, if you want to know who the workers vote for today, the main political force that vote for are the National Front. You are more workers voting for the National Front than for any other party. So, this is the way that could lead to anti-social movement. So I think that for social scientists, it's very important not to work only on social movements or only on anti-social movements, racism, terrorism, violence, and what. No, we should work on both. Of course, we cannot do everything. So some of us can be specialized in this or in that. But when we try to generalize, to theorize, to discuss, we must have all this in, I think, in our minds. And this leads me to my point number 6 or 7, I don't know, which is how do we do when we are in face of violence, in face of anti-social movements? How do we? And here I can just say one word. You have many, many people that have a lot to say on violence. And when I say violence, social and political violence, first of all. And at the world scale, at the world level, you have many people that have participated within NGOs, as diplomats, as lawyers, as social workers sometimes, and so on, that have participated in dealing with terrible violence. How do you finish with genocide? How do you finish with massacres and so on? So, you have a lot of expertise. Military also know a lot. But this is not a real domain for social science. Exiting violence or preventing violence is not a domain for us. Violence is a key domain for social science. We have been, there is no one important sociologist who has not said something about violence. But exiting, preventing violence should also become domains of research, sociological research, anthropological research, and not only violence, or not only having experts, diplomats, and so on and so on, having something to say, but we should just listen to them. So my point here for the future is that I think that we should have more and more people working on justice. What is justice? There are some people working on this, of course. I don't know in English, la justice réparative, reparative justice. There are people working and doing very interesting things, but not enough. We need much more on this. We need much more on what does it mean preventing violence. We have many people that work on radicalization, or we have been working on radicalization, Islamist movements and so on. We don't have so many people out of experts that have something today from a social science perspective on de-radicalization, which is also a key. So this was my main. And so maybe I could end with just a last point. Yes, it's time then. My last point is methodology. Maybe I am not totally objective in what I'm going to say now. But first of all, I don't like the idea that methodology is a separate arena, is a separate field. You have theoreticians, you have people that go on the field, and you have people that discuss on methodology. So I don't accept that. I think that when you are a researcher, the method is the way you have to articulate your theoretical perspective and the objects you are working on. You will not work with the same tools if you are working on this or on that. This is clear for me. But my point here is that we have, first of all, a key point, which is what I said about digital era. So the methodology is changing a lot with this. But this is not my point. My point is that I don't know very important new methodology which had been created during the last 50 years, out of technology, out of digital technology. The last, for me, so this is where I am not very objective, the last new methodology was Alain Tourain's proposal of sociological intervention. So I don't have time to tell more about this methodology. But it's a very unique way to deal with, as you said, general geopolitical, global issues, and at the same time, the subject, personal, individual. It's the only methodology that I know that propose to actors to be actors, not to be transformed into researchers, but being able to analyze their own action, whatever it is, and so on. So my point is, it is very surprising that such a new methodology have met such little interest, generally speaking. We were very enthusiastic, and Antimo could say a lot about that, when this methodology was invented and when we tried to implement it and to use it in many different ways. But today, a very few people try to make sociological interventions. So my point is, the social scientists should be more curious, should be more interested, not necessarily by this methodology, but by the idea that if we are entering a new world, which is a technological world on the one hand, but which is also a social, cultural, religious, and so on, new world. If we need new intellectual ideas, is what I was saying on social movement, but that we need also new methodological tools. And that this methodology of Touraine was maybe the beginning of some new ways of making sociology. Many others should be invented, of course. My point is, we are not very creative, methodologically, I think, and this is part of the general crisis, I think, of sociology today, as I said at the beginning, not being part of the public debate, or very little. And so these were my points. I tried not to speak only of the past and to define some aspect of what could be the future. I tried not to speak too much about myself. I hate historians that make compulsory in my country. If you want to become a professor in history, you have to pass a kind of test which is called habilitation. And this habilitation included, I'm not sure it still does it, but it included recently at least a so-called ego history. I speak about myself. So of course I've been speaking about myself, but I try not to be too much in ego sociology. So thank you for your patience. Il est là.
Merci Michel for your presentation, for your lecture. Maybe if there is someone who has questions, suggestions, can ask something to Michel. I have some questions, of course, many of them, but maybe I will focus on just one. Maybe after I will try to do asking something else. About the methodology, I had the chance to experiment a little bit the sociological intervention during my PhD with Antimo. We did this in France, in England, on the alter global movements. And with Daniele, with which we realized research on extreme right here in Italy, we tried to apply this methodology, the sociological intervention, but we had so many difficulties to realize it in a proper way. As it should be, let's say. So my question is this methodology can be used in every context, every fieldwork, or there are some fieldwork that are not, the actors don't want to share their visions inside a process like the methodological intervention. It's not just a methodology, but it's a process of research, let's say. That's the first question. The other one is about the neutrality, the first point you touched. When I start to research on extreme right, far right movements, the first thing that with Daniele we faced in our milieu, academic milieu and political milieu, trade union, etc., all the people say, but why are you so interested about far-right movements? Why you speak with them? Why you share with them your points? There is no... the most common thing is that, you are becoming fascist, so that's the reason why you're speaking with them. So I see that it's very difficult to keep this neutrality, not just with the movement with which you have empathy, but also with the movement with which you don't share the worldview, etc., but from the opposite point of view, let's say, of the neutrality. So being distant from your object should be and must be your first principle to study this kind of movement. I don't think that that's the real way to understand social action if you don't create contact with them. That's my 2 points.
Wow, I need a long time to give you serious answers. I will try to. The first point, what can be the use of this methodology of sociological intervention out of what was done at the very beginning, that is to say, working with and on actors that either were part of the new social movements of the new era or part of the old social movements of the industrial society. So my answer is many other things can be done on two different perspectives. First of all, we can study, we can work on many, many other issues. And he started a few years after the end of the first program with Alain Touraine. With Alain Touraine, we have been working on the working class movement on the one hand, and on the other hand, environmental movement, women's movement, and so on. So, okay. Then, François Dubé, a good friend and colleague, worked on young delinquent, marginal members of marginal minorities. You know, these young people in the suburbs and so on. At the same moment, I've been making sociological intervention with terrorist people. I started with Italian leftist terrorists, and I can tell you it was a very interesting sociological work. But I have also made an intervention on managers of EDF, Électricité de France, a big company. So my first point is you can go to very different issues. And then I made sociological intervention with racist people. And I will come to your point after that. And my other perspective on what I said. When we are doing sociological intervention with students, we had money, people, institutional support. Very, very good conditions. When you are a young student making your PhD and you want to make a sociological intervention, of course you don't have people, money, resources, institutional support, or not so big and so. But you can do something. I remember a good friend of mine, Daniel Jacquin, who decided to make by himself a sociological intervention on a social movement which was very interesting, which was called LEAP. The older here maybe you remember, it was in 73 or 74, workers in a company which was producing watches, LEAP, and the owners decided to finish with this company, to close everything, and they decided not to accept. They took all the watches. It was a very interesting movement. He went alone. He did something, a kind of bricolage, but doing what he could, and it was very, very interesting. So my point is, with less resources and on many other fields, you can, with some imagination, you can do interesting research. Now, your point on neutrality and so on. I have been working with awful people, terrorists, racist, anti-Semitic people, and so on. So, I think it is possible to work with them if, first of all, they know who you are. This is my point. And they know that you are not a spy, you are not working in order to fight against them. No. You are willing to understand better and to help them to understand better what they do. I will give you just one example, because it was a great moment in my life. One day, I was introduced to the leader of the more important skinheads group in Paris. Everybody in France knows him, Batskin. He's still very famous. Extreme right, very clever. So I was introduced to him. He knew who I was. He was clever, he was educated. And I told him, I would like to know more about you, and maybe it could be interesting for you to know more. And he accepted. And we made a sociological intervention. I have no time to tell you stories, but I can tell you. They wanted to discuss with a policeman. I asked a chief of police to come and spend 2 hours with them. They wanted to discuss with an historian. I asked Michel Wieviorka, a very important French historian, to discuss. They wanted to discuss with a political actor. I asked to a member of parliament, Françoise Gaspard, a friend of us, and so on. They were happy to discuss. They could be very violent, but we did it. So I did not change them. I learned a lot. Maybe they learned something. I'm not sure, because the leader was clever, but the other people were really not so clever, to say it like that. And so it was possible. My point is that generally, generally there is a moment when nothing can be done with this kind of methodology. when the ideology is totally strong, when the actor knows exactly what they want and they will not change their mind. I mean, a pure terrorist actor cannot participate in this kind of research. But those people that are not at the very center of a terrorist movement, and so they can be interested. I've met many Italian terrorists in Paris. You must know that in the 80s with Mitterrand, you had more or less 1,000 people coming from Italy in Paris. So you just push the door at the journal Libération and ask to some journalists, do you know some people that could discuss with me? Or you just ask to some lawyers. I mean, it was very easy to be in touch with them. And most of them, but not all of them, were interested in this, knowing who I am, and I knew what they are. And maybe, this is my main point, this can help people to understand why they should finish with terrorism, racism. And I would like to finish with a very, very devastating research that I have done. Because sometimes it's a failure, sometimes it's not a success. I was making research on racism in France. And with two other sociologists, we went in a city in the north of France whose name is Roubaix, very poor industrial city, but industries were disappearing, and in a very, very poor neighborhood. So we found some petits blancs, poor white people living in a very poor neighborhood with migrants and so on, very racist people. We did not tell them we want to make a research on you as racist, but we said something like, we are making a research on the problems you face in your neighborhood and so on. But they very quickly understood that we were working on racism because it was possible through this process. And there was a moment, which was the very end of the research, where they accepted to discuss their own racism, how they became racist. It was wonderful for the sociologists. We were arriving at the end of the process. It was 50, 60 hours with these people. We were arriving at the end of this process with a group of 10 people, petits blancs, women and men, were able to explain how they became racist. And suddenly, it was the very, very, very end of the meeting, the 2 or 3 last hours, one of them started to say awful things about black people, Arabs, but things that I cannot say, terrible, and accusing themselves. For example, a woman accused another woman to have a love story with an Arab, but she did not say an Arab, and so devastating. And it was the end of the research. And I came back to Paris by car at midnight with my 2 colleagues, and the day after I had 40 degrees fever, because at the very end of the research, people make an analysis of the problem we want to analyze with them, and suddenly go back to the more terrible, much more than before, racism. So my analysis after that, so it was very, very difficult for me. But my analysis is that you cannot have help people to analyze their action, whatever it is, but in this case, racism, in this kind of situation, if you don't organize also, and I say it in French, la redescente, going down, back to normal life. Because what I imagine now, these people say, okay, these 3 people from Paris, they go back in their car, in their beautiful house, in the capital city, they have money, they can live correctly, they don't have to deal with so many problems, and so on. So, and we make the research, and now they say bye-bye, and it's finished for them, okay. But we understand better that there is no solution to our problem. So, my point is that it is not so easy to make research with racist people and so on. And when you can do it, the problem is how do you do with actors in order to make them going back to normal life after the research without this kind of problem. So I don't know if it is an answer to your point, but these are real issues. So to finish with my answer, when I was working on terrorism in the Basque country, I met many people. I never met the key central activist of the terrorist action because they would not talk with me, and I could not talk with them. But I met people that were not so far, or that were sometimes active and sometimes not active, and so on. I mean, and or that people that decided to finish with this, and so. But the very core you cannot do. But you can go. I will make a comparison. You can go on the top of the volcano. The volcano is active, but you cannot jump in the middle of the volcano. But you can go all around and see and make many, many analyses because you are very near.
Ok, un attimo, vengo. Allora facciamo prima un attimo, dai.
Michel, I would like to have your point of view about the centrality of social movement today in today's countries. I mean, European and American countries, North American countries. Do you think we can study the society to become the analysis by studying social movements? No, yeah. What do you think?
Tu veux que je collecte un peu de questions?
Non, je pense que c'est une belle question. Donc, and it's a pleasure for me to discuss with Antimo because we have been working together in the late 70s or early 80s. So today, it's not a good time for social movements. And it's not a good time because the new social movements are beginning to appear. I will make a comparison, an historical comparison. The working class movement was really a social movement in our countries at the end of the 19th century. I don't know Italian history of the working class movement, but in France I can tell you the CGT, the main trade unions, was created in 1895 or something like that. But at the very beginning of the 19th century, we had a lot of struggles. We had people that decided to break machines, like in England, Luddism. You had people that were discussing in some taverns or in some places, dirty places, just to discuss. People trying to make utopias, to define what could be socialism. There is a beautiful book by Jacques Rancière, the title of which is The Night of Proletarians, which is how these people were discussing. There are people that say we should make strikes, other people that say we should be violent, other people and make a revolution, other people that say no, we should build cooperatives, mutual funds, and so on. Many, many different things, no unity. So, to give you my answer, we are today in something like 1820 or 1830. We are before the growth of all those new social movements that could come from what we see. But when I see the women's movement, the Black Lives Movement in America, when I see the environmental movement, it's a lot. And it's so they are not so strong, not so able to be listened, but they are strong, and they will be more and more, and we shall have other aspects. So I still consider that social movements will build the future, if this is your question, but we don't have all the necessary tools to work on them, and they are not as strong as they, because they are in the beginning of their existence, and we should have a long-term historical view and not only a too contemporary view of what is at stake. I don't know if...
Was another question?
Thank you. I have very much appreciated your alert for this confusion between social science, social research on the one side, and on the other side, the social activism. There is a sort of perverse melting between these two dimensions. I think that this is a very important issue, but it's not only an internal problem, an internal to social scientists. I think, for example, at the fact that in the framework of the European Union, that you know is the main founder of the research now, the foundings and the callings for social research are always thought with a particular scheme, a particular framework, that is, we say what is a good society, what a good society should be, and then on this basis we call scientists and researchers to actively realize this good society. So there is participation, democracy, the implementation of a society without all good things. I don't question about this. But anyway, when you are in front of the form for asking the founding of a research, you have always to think your research as instrumental to the realization of these social objectives that, I repeat, I don't question in their good foundation, but I think that it is a sort of disturb in the logic of social research. What do you think about this? But because there is no reaction by social scientists, I don't see any reaction towards this kind of framework.
Well, I can give you a rather precise but limited answer. During 6 years, from more or less 2014 to 2020, it is very recent, I have been a member of the scientific board of the European Research Council, ERC. So we were 20 or 22 researchers from all disciplines. I was the sociology, I was the social science, as I was an historian also. So, but also, I don't know, medical doctors, physics, biology, and big scientists. So, ERC is dealing with billions of euros for research. And if you want to be a grantee at ERC, what you have to do is to write a project with your CV and so on, but the main thing is the project. The project, you don't have any indication of what you should work on. There is no program, there is no proposal, there is no. If you want to work on this or on that, you write your project exactly as you want to do it. Nobody tells you what to think. Then your project is discussed in a panel. So there are many panels, and each panel has its own logic. Your project will be in the first time read by some experts out of the panel or in the panel. I don't remember, but this is not important. And then the 50 best projects or the 40 best projects for each panel will have the secondary step, which is oral presentation. So if your project is accepted at this first step, you are invited to present it in front of the panel. So you have exactly the same time than other candidates. You present your project. You have, 20 minutes, half an hour. You answer to some questions. It's exactly the same for every candidate. And then each panel says, we have, for instance, 20 million euros. So the first, and there is a hierarchy of all candidates. So the first candidate wants 2 million. The second, 1.8 million, and so. So you arrive at the project number 12, for instance, and then the total of the money is gone. You have the 20 million gone to all these projects. No discussion. They don't say in these panels, oh, this guy wants too much money. He says he wants 2 million, we shall give him 1 million. They say yes or no to your project. Maybe after there could be some discussion because there is no reason for you to drive a Ferrari to go in a factory to make field work. So I exaggerate. So what I want to say is this is the country of what you have been describing. So in Brussels, there are other institutions that give money for research at the European level, which are following what you said. But there is always at least one institution with a lot of money that respects social science, which is not always the case, that work differently. And I would like to finish with a very interesting example, because the idea is that research should be decided bottom up and not, as you described it, top down by technocrats, bureaucrats that know better than you what is good and what is not good for society. No. When I was there, it was in 2018 or 19, I don't remember exactly, it was said by the European Commission that there should be more research on migrations. It's a key issue, we should work on migration, and it was your point, migrants and so on. And so, the people, the leaders of ERC said, okay, let us see what we have done bottom up on migrants. And they published a report demonstrating that without any incitation or any top-down strong pressure, ERC had been the places where a great number of researchers have been granted money to work on migration, which means researchers are maybe more clever than the Commission. They know before and better what is interesting. So my point is, you are right for a certain number of activities, of research activity. But the case of ERC is different, and it's a key institution. So have a look on the internet, you will find a lot of things. It's very interesting. It is really bottom up and not top down. This is what I wanted to precise.
Another question?
Good morning, Professor. I am a PhD student, and I would like to ask a question on the topic of populism, because it's the topic I am dealing with my PhD research. And so you talked about populist movements and social movements. And so in my opinion, populist movements are different from socialist movements because they are not based on social classes. So they are interclassist movements. In your opinion, what is, if it's possible to find it, a shared identity in these movements? Because in social movements, there was a class identity that's well defined, in my opinion. But in this case, being part of the people is not so clear, because the people is a vague concept. So what is the glue of these movements, in your opinion? Thank you.
You are right. You are right. And this means that it is very difficult to propose solid definitions of what is populism. If you are making your PhD, you have certainly read a certain number of books explaining the different kinds of populism. Margaret Donovan, Canavan. No, there was also a big conference with Ernest Gellner and so on. I mean, there are lots of books. The result is we cannot propose a very unique, acceptable for everybody definition of what is populism. So my point was, I don't define populism through the notion of identity, through the notion of class and so on. I tried to define it as a mythical discourse, that is to say, a discourse that proposes a an answer, an imaginary answer to problems that in the real life cannot be solved. So now, if it is like that, you can have different elements that contribute to the myth, and we can change. I will take the French case, which is very interesting. When the National Front in France became a populist movement, a political populist movement, and not only, as it was at the very beginning, a pure extreme right organization. In 1972, when it was created, it was a pure extreme right mixture of neo-Nazis, neo-fascists, people having nostalgia from French Algeria, and so on. It's extremist. But then in 1982 or 83, it became a populist political movement. And at that time, it was, first of all, far from any class dimension. First of all, it was a national populism, as some people said, nationalist. The nation was a key part. And the social was not so important, because among the voters, you had some workers, but you have also les petits commerçants, small businesses, small business, artisans, I mean, many different people. So, but then it changed. Today, as I said, it's not a class party, but the same discourse makes possible to have many workers or former workers being electors of this party. So what I want to say is that a political populist party can change the components of its, let us call it, identity, of it, who is supposed to vote for them. It can change. What is important is the possibility to have together different elements that will recognize that they agree on some aspect. So that would be my point. So don't try to know who are. Is it a class movement? You will never find a solution to this, I think. What you will find are elements that make possible or not a class dimension in a populist party. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. The People's Party in America, end of the 19th century, was a class party, if I can say it like that. Some cotton small farmers. It was a movement of small cotton farmers in this. There was a social dimension, if not a class dimension. So, but you have other populist movements that have absolutely no class dimension. So my point is that, I hope I am clear, don't try to define them as class or not class. Sometimes they are very nationalist, sometimes not so much. Sometimes they are very racist, sometimes not so much. Sometimes they are anti-Semitic, but sometimes you have Jews that have a key role in a populist party. I mean, it's mythical. It's totally a contradictory mixture of elements. So, but also, when you have a populist party, if you are the people, if you speak in name of the people, you must say who is in and who is not in. So it will not be defined as a class. It will be defined as a people and maybe as a nation, and it will say who is supposed not to be part of it. And in our countries, who is not going to be part of it? First of all, migrants, or Arabs, or whatever. So this would be the way I would try to work on populism. But I'm not doing your PhD, so...
Maybe we have some other questions.
Would it be useful introduce another type of new movement, the humanitarianism? A new type, the movement founded about the human right, but also on the emotion, passion, creativity, to guarantee the affirmation of the subject.
Well, I did not have time to You should invite me not for 2 hours, but for 1 year, because these are huge issues. I think that today you cannot build a concept of social movement without taking seriously into consideration the notion of subject. But the notion of subject is dangerous because it can lead to a kind of essentialization of who you are working on. So I think it's more interesting to work on the notion, the double notion of processes of subjectivation. People are more and more subject, and desubjectivation. People are less and less subject. And being subject more and more means being more and more able to speak in his or her own name, but also taking into consideration others. If I am a subject, if I hate a group of people, I am not a real subject. I must. This is rather Kantian as a principle, but I would defend it. You cannot be a subject if you don't consider that all human being also has the right to be a subject. So the desubjectivation comes, for instance, when you don't consider all human beings as possibly subject. So I don't know the movements you are quoting, but I think that the movements in the future will insist more and more on this dimension, which is also connected with the idea of having more rights. I like a sentence by Hannah Arendt, who says something about the right to have rights, which is a beautiful formula. And I think that this is part of the new social movements. I would not say, in the past, the working class movement, there was a moment when people say, we want to be the leaders of the society. This will never be the case with the new social movement. You will not have people saying, in name of climate change or in name of equality between men and women, we should be at the head of the society. It's not like that. Even if you can find sometimes people speaking like that, but it's not the core, not the more important. So you are right. The humanitarian dimensions, subjectivity and so on are key aspects. This is why we should build new concepts of social movement. And not forgetting everything, but taking much more seriously. In 1984, finish with this, on this point. In 1984, Alain Touraine published a very important book. The title was Le Retour de l'acteur, The Return of the Actor. And a few times after, he told me, this was not the good title. I should have called it The Return of the Subject. But this was coming after 30 or 20 years of domination of very structuralist ideas, which were fighting against the notion of subject. And so today we are much more in this notion. We accept it. More people accept. You see this idea of subjectivity everywhere now. Everywhere. So we must transform it into a tool for understanding better the new social actors. If this is true, it means also that we must give much more importance to culture and not only to social relationships.
Questions quickly?
I'd like to ask just a comment about the importance of the interdisciplinary dialogues, because maybe there are not realistic views among us of different fields of research and the different disciplines and scientific discourse. So if just aside the problem of the creative method that I believe is so strong and important, and aside the adequate distance from the movement, the people, as a matter of the research, how we can dialogue among different researchers. And if we are sociologists interested in climate change movements, in the Anthropocene problems of the planet, so how we can do a non-authoritative methods and approach about society when we are in dialogue with so different fields of research and thought.
First of all, I would say that I am in favor of interdisciplinarity, but I am also in favor of disciplinarity. We must be good in our discipline, to say it like that. Then, interdisciplinarity is for me very useful if I am sure that the people that I'm working with in other disciplines are good. The problem is that sometimes in name of interdisciplinarity, you don't have the best ones. So that would be my first point. And I think it's good to have a discipline. I am a sociologist. I would never say that I am an anthropologist or an historian or whatever, even if I love to read anthropology, history, and that's my first point. My second point is that it is my experience very useful for everyone, including from a disciplinary perspective, to participate in exchanges with people belonging not only to other disciplines, but also with actors. For instance, I love to work with social workers. I love to work with medical doctors. I could give some examples. And I think that this can bring more understanding to some problem. Of course, if you say climate change, take this example, sociologists maybe are not the first ones that can bring solutions. But you have heard about, I don't know in English how you call it, in French we call it GIEC, G-I-E-C. They publish the more important scientific reports on climate change. Le GIEC, I don't know how it is called in English or in Italian. It's well, every year or every 2 years, people say, the report of the GIEC is coming, and it's a key document with people that have been working on it all over the world and belonging to many disciplines. And 1 year, it was maybe 10 or 15 years ago, one friend of us, Antimo knows him very well, and you have known him, Yvon Lebot, who was with a sociologist, told me, I've got the Nobel Prize. He was very serious. And it was true, the Nobel Prize for, I don't know which was, it was for peace or something, was given to the GIEC for its report on climate change. So a sociologist among thousands of people that have participated in this report could say, I am one of the thousands of people that are being given a Nobel Prize. So it's an example of sociology being part of climate change discussions at a very high level. I have another case which is very interesting. Today, you have more and more in hospitals, in big hospitals, ethical committees. When a difficult case arises, for instance, a question of death and life, what do we do with this person? We don't know if we should have this person still in life or cut oxygen and so on. We don't know. Sometimes it's not clear, and medical doctors don't say. It is the committee is asked to deal with this case. What is a committee like this? I know some people that participate in it. Medical doctors, other medical staff, psychologists, philosophers, lawyers, social workers, sociologists, and many others. So they make interviews, they read everything which can be read. And at the very end, they don't say you should do this. No. They say there are 3 hypotheses or 4 hypotheses. The first one, if you do this and that, the conclusion will be, but the difficulties will be, and so on. So they help to analyze. So this is it can be very useful to have sociology being part of this kind of debate. So my answer to you is, I don't think we should organize only interdisciplinary ways of working, but we need interdisciplinary moments. This is, for me, very important. And here there is a problem, which is a very concrete problem. If I am a professor and a student comes to me and says, I want to work on climate change, I want to be a sociologist, I want to work on climate change, and I want to be part of interdisciplinary research, and I will make an interdisciplinary thesis, in fact. I would say to this student, never do that. Because when you have an interdisciplinary diploma, you don't find a job. Because a university likes disciplines. So it's also another aspect. We should not say that we like interdisciplinarity if this is not recognized by the institution. This is another aspect of your point.
Thank you, Professor, for this lecture. There are many questions I'd like to ask, but I will just stick to one remark about your concept of axiological neutrality, just to make sure I got you right, because that's really interesting and applicable to what I do. So to give you just a very quick background, I'm a sociologist. I work in bioethics as applied to health issues, and I work in the European project environment. So from what I've understood so far of my work, axiological neutrality is a very strong rhetoric that social actors use in this context, especially to justify their claims and exercising their power when they have them, especially pharma industries. And the reasons why they can do this is because simply and bluntly, they put themselves at the center of the picture. And sociology, from what I hope I can see, is the best discipline, maybe together with anthropology and good journalism, very good journalism, to illustrate people where they are on the map, to show them they are not the center of the map, maybe to help them understand there is not a center of the map. And to do that, to free social actors from their own silos, to connect on the disciplines. I guess sociology has to first, as you said at the beginning of the lecture, connect its own silos. So my question, and I know it's a $1 million question, is, do you think it's still feasible for sociology to get out of the silos in which it is constrained?
Well, I think that if many people speak like you and me today, it becomes possible. The problem is that the forces that organize silos are so strong. If you are this young sociologist that wants to make a PhD, then I convince, for instance, this young sociologist to make a sociological PhD, not an interdisciplinary one. Okay, so, and I say, you want to be a sociologist, a professor, and so on later, so please listen to me. Do a very narrow research, because with a very narrow point, it will be more easy for you to publish. If you make a general research, you will be in competition with so many solid professors and so on that your article will not be accepted. It's difficult when you are a young. So the strategy of young researchers will be more and more, I want to be published, so I must exist. If I want to exist, I must be the best specialist of something, and to be the best specialist of something, the better is to find a very narrow silo. So the tendency is like that. So, and you can find other explanations. So my answer to your point is, if we want to transform intellectual life, we must also take very seriously institutional realities. And we don't like to do that. I mean, it's boring. I mean, institutional life is boring. Being the head of a department is boring. It's administration, it's meetings and meetings and so on. You don't make research, generally, when you finish with. And then, after, if you don't make research during 5 years or 10 years, after that, you never make. You never come back. So, this is a problem. We need transformations of institutions. And here, but it was not my point today, I would be very, very strongly in favor of small institutes connected with a general system of universities and so on, but with a lot of freedom for small units. A little bit like in German with the Max Planck Institute. So I would be in favor. So, but in a country like France, and I don't know in Italy, but it's difficult to promote this. But so my point is that we must be able to exert a pressure, an institutional pressure, sometimes a political pressure, to finish with top-down research. It's not only European research. I can tell you that in my country, you have people that decide what should be studied and what should not be studied at the level of the nation system. So many things should change at that level. That's true. So, but who likes to do that? Not necessarily the best ones. But we have to, in many American universities, people say, okay, I will give 4 years of my life to be at the head of the department. Don't ask me more, but I will do it. I will do it. I have many good friends that have done it. So maybe we should also imagine this kind of way of dealing with administration, ruling a department, and so on. So, but there are institutional dimensions in your question. Merci.